in the heart of the Sahel, where food insecurity and ecological devastation have long held nations hostage, one president released 1 million chickens and dared the world to laugh. It was not a joke. It was a gamble that stunned diplomats, angered economists, and defied every conventional playbook on pest control and rural development. While desert locusts devoured harvests and imported pesticides poisoned the soil, President Ibrahim Traoré stood before a skeptical nation and declared, "We will fight hunger with feathers." What followed was not chaos, but a blueprint for something radically new. Could the humblest bird become the symbol of national sovereignty? Could a landlocked country defend its crops, feed its children, and challenge dependency using chickens? Stay with us. This is not just an agricultural story. It is a lesson in courage, sovereignty, and the kind of innovation that rewrites the rules. Subscribe to follow the full story and be part of a movement shaping Africa's future. In early 2024, Burkina Faso stood on the edge of collapse. Desert locusts were blackening the skies, stripping millet and maize fields bare. Caterpillars chewed through sorghum like wildfire. In village after village, entire harvests disappeared within days, triggering food shortages and panic. For a nation where over 60% of the population depends on agriculture, it was not just an ecological disaster, it was a direct assault on national stability. Western donors offered pesticides. Aid agencies proposed expensive aerial spraying campaigns. But President Ibrahim Traoré saw something deeper. Not just poisoned crops, but poisoned sovereignty. Every liter of pesticide from Europe, he said in Parliament, comes with a debt we cannot afford. Our solution must grow from our soil, not someone else's lab. Then came the shock. On live national television, Traoré announced a radical plan. Burkina Faso would breed and release 1 million chickens, yes, chickens, into the wild. His logic? Each bird is a natural predator of insects. Chickens devour caterpillars, beetles, and even young locusts with relentless efficiency. A single chicken can eat hundreds of pests per day. Multiply that by 1 million and you have a living army, cheap, sustainable, and native. Officials gasped. The press mocked. International observers scoffed. But the plan was already in motion. Within weeks, hatcheries across the country began ramping up production. Agricultural engineers mapped strategic drop zones across provinces, ensuring coverage from the savannas of the east to the rocky north. Military logistics teams, more used to transporting weapons, now moved crates of clucking birds. No region was ignored. From Kaya to Bobo Dioulasso, from Gawa to Djibo, the birds were deployed like battalions. It was not cheap. The cost of raising and transporting the chickens, building temporary holding facilities, and training local distributors ran into the tens of millions. The opposition called it poultry populism. European tabloids headlined it as Burkina's bird-brained blunder. But Traoré did not flinch. Standing in a wind-swept village in the center north, he said calmly, "What is expensive is importing failure. What is priceless is feeding our children." Then came the day of release. In 52 coordinated locations, villagers gathered in dusty fields. Trucks rumbled in. Crates were opened. Thousands of chickens, brown, white, and speckled, fluttered into freedom. Children cheered. Elders watched in silence. Drones overhead captured the moment, flocks of birds fanning out across the Sahel, scratching at the soil, pecking at locusts. It looked absurd, but it was calculated. Within days, reports began to surface. Pest damage was down. In one region in the Boucle du Mouhoun, sorghum fields previously ravaged by caterpillars saw an 80% reduction in insect presence. In eastern markets, egg supplies doubled within weeks, driving prices down and lifting household nutrition levels. Local farmers, once skeptical, now spoke of the chickens who saved the harvest. Elders on community radio praised the president for turning instinct into strategy. "No one ever thought of fighting locusts with chickens," one man said, "but it's working." What had begun as a desperate gamble was turning into a case study. Biologists from the University of Ouagadougou began monitoring ecological impact. They noted increased biodiversity, improved soil aeration, and the reduction of pests without a drop of pesticide. Regional governments, including Niger and Mali, quietly sent observers. In the countryside, a new phrase emerged: Le Plan des Plumes, the feathered plan. But while early results were promising, questions remained. Could chickens truly substitute for a national pest control program? Would the ecological balance hold? And most critically, was this the first chapter of a food revolution or just a flash of presidential theater? Stay with us, because in the next chapter, we follow the chickens into the fields, the markets, and the hearts of a nation still holding its breath. The turning point came not in a speech or summit, but in a field outside Fadangorma. A farmer named Adama Wedraogo stood ankle-deep in healthy maize, wiping sweat from his brow as reporters gathered around. His words were simple. Last year, caterpillars ate everything. This year, we have chickens. He gestured toward the edge of his land, where a dozen birds scratched the soil, snapping up larvae and beetles. We did not spray. We did not pray. We just let the chickens work. That single interview, aired on state television, went viral across Francophone Africa. It was no longer a theory. It was a reality on the ground. Within a month, stories like Adama's emerged across the nation. In Tenkodogo, sorghum yields were up 35%. In Dori, eggs flooded markets, and women vendors spoke of new profits. One local trader said, "We used to sell tomatoes. Now we sell chickens, and both feed our families." Village radios, WhatsApp groups, and community newsletters buzzed with updates. Which regions had the healthiest birds, which crops were thriving, how many eggs were collected each week. The emotional tide had turned. In a country so often battered by headlines of poverty and insurgency, hope was rare currency. The chicken release gave people a story to believe in, a story they had seen with their own eyes. At the heart of the momentum stood President Ibrahim Traoré. While critics still rolled their eyes in international boardrooms, he doubled down domestically. He gave interviews from poultry farms. He visited markets with first-generation chicken beneficiaries. His speeches blended science with pride. These are not just chickens. They are farmers, fighters, and feeders, and the press followed. One viral headline from the Burkina News Tribune read, "The chicken coup, how 1 million birds turned the tide." In neighboring Mali, newspapers dubbed him Le Président Plume, the feathered president. International media, once derisive, began to shift tone. The BBC ran a segment titled, "Can Chickens Save Africa's Crops?" Al Jazeera aired drone footage of chickens marching through cassava fields like feathery infantry. What began as ridicule turned to curiosity, then to cautious respect. And the numbers backed the shift. By the third month post-release, crop losses in treated regions dropped between 30% to 60%. Meanwhile, international reactions were conflicted. European think tanks issued white papers warning about ecological imbalance. A French agriculture minister scoffed on record, "Chickens are not strategy." But Traoré didn't flinch. His response, delivered in perfect French during a press conference, was cutting, "What's not strategic is importing pesticides with colonial price tags." In the Sahel, however, regional leaders began to listen closely. Delegations from Niger, Chad, and even Senegal sent agricultural observers. A high-level minister from Mali admitted off-record, "We spend millions fighting pests every year. If chickens can do the job, why not?" But beyond numbers and headlines, it was the emotional narrative that transformed public perception. One village elder in Banfora said it best. "In the war against hunger, chickens are our soldiers, and they ask for nothing but grain." Women's groups, long excluded from agricultural decision-making, emerged as key stakeholders. 30% of the chickens had been distributed to female-headed households, a quiet but revolutionary move. These women, often managing both farms and families, became vocal advocates. Their testimonials flooded community radio, stories of children fed, crops protected, and pride restored. Even opposition parties were cornered. Their early critiques now rang hollow in the face of farmers' gratitude. One analyst noted, "You cannot run against chickens in Burkina Faso. Not anymore." But the real brilliance lay in how Traoré weaponized the symbolism. He framed the success not as charity but as sovereignty. In speeches, he contrasted chickens with pesticides. One is alive, local, renewable. The other is dead, foreign, fleeting. His language sharpened into narrative. Burkina Faso had rejected dependency. fought nature with nature, and turned ridicule into resilience. And yet, behind the euphoria, serious questions remained. Would the chickens survive long-term? Could this model scale nationwide? What about diseases, overgrazing, and ecological trade-offs? In the next chapter, we examine those cracks beneath the feathers, how a symbolic victory demands structural reform to hold. Because a nation cannot live on stories alone. By the 6th month of the chicken deployment, the transformation was undeniable. But it wasn't just happening in the fields. It was unfolding in the villages, in government halls, and even across Burkina Faso's borders. A simple agricultural maneuver was evolving into a political earthquake, and at its center stood Ibrahim Traoré. In a country where faith in government had long been eroded by poverty, coups, and neglect, the chickens became a powerful bridge between the state and its most forgotten citizens. Farmers who once saw leaders as distant or indifferent now spoke of the president with familiarity. "He gave us chickens," said one elder in Koudougou, "and with them, he gave us proof that we matter." That sentiment rippled through civil society. Local councils were no longer passive receivers of top-down policy. They were distributors, coordinators, even strategists. The decentralization of chicken delivery empowered regional leaders to organize logistics, manage fair distribution, and monitor impact. In doing so, the state didn't just deliver chickens, it restored a sense of functional governance. Traoré understood this deeply. He had learned, as many populists do, that policy is power when it becomes personal. Instead of grand development plans read from podiums, he gave people something tangible to hold, feed, and trade. A chicken in hand was worth more than 1,000 unkept promises. That personal investment translated into soaring approval ratings. Independent polling from the University of Ouagadougou showed a 23-point rise in Traoré's favorability among rural voters. Among women-headed households, the largest beneficiaries of the program, his support exceeded 70%. His cabinet quickly moved to institutionalize the project, announcing plans for the National Poultry Resilience Program, making the strategy part of the national budget, not just an emergency measure. Opposition parties found themselves cornered. Mocking the program now risked alienating tens of thousands of rural voters. Their messaging fractured. Some pivoted to claiming the idea had been theirs all along. Others fell silent. None found traction. The chickens had become politically untouchable. Economically, the strategy triggered unexpected ripple effects. Smallholders who once survived season to season now found new income streams. Chickens bred, laid eggs, were traded for grain or sold in local markets. Poultry cooperatives began forming spontaneously. Feed producers sprang up using leftover millet husks and sorghum stems. Women, often marginalized in formal markets, took charge of roadside egg stalls and micro-hatcheries. In several provinces, informal poultry hubs emerged, miniature economies with traders, transporters, feed suppliers, and vet workers all feeding off the feathered economy. Local NGOs pivoted to support this emerging ecosystem, offering microcredit for chicken shelters, community vet kits, and low-cost feed mills. This bottom-up economy energized the countryside. The Ministry of Commerce soon reported an 11% rise in rural trade volume within program zones. The Central Bank of West Africa noted a stabilization of food prices and a 4% bump in domestic poultry exports, remarkable for a country once reliant on imports for its animal protein. Yet the effects went beyond numbers. Psychologically, the program restored confidence. In a region often portrayed as fragile and dependent, Burkina Faso had become a case study in self-reliance. The president's gamble had not only worked, it had inspired, and the world began to take notice. At an African Union roundtable in Addis Ababa, Traoré presented Burkina Faso's model as a sovereign food security doctrine. The room, filled with presidents, ministers, and international donors, listened as he declared, "We did not wait for permission. We did not wait for grants. We acted with what we had, and it worked." The room gave him a standing ovation. Niger, Chad, and Mali expressed formal interest in replicating the strategy. Senegal invited Burkinabe technicians for workshops. Even Ghana's Minister of Agriculture tweeted praise, calling it a masterclass in local innovation. International NGOs, once dismissive, now scrambled to reframe the program as community-led pest management. Some even sought to co-brand it. But Traore didn't bite. His narrative was clear. Burkina Faso had solved an African problem with African creativity. Still, beneath the celebration lay a pressing challenge. Could the model scale regionally without collapsing under its own success? Would it retain its magic if copied by bureaucracies in larger, more complex economies? And how would Burkina Faso protect its intellectual and political ownership of the idea? In the next chapter, we follow the chickens beyond the border, into Niger, Mali, and beyond, to see whether Traoré's vision becomes a continental revolution or remains a one-country miracle. When Burkina Faso's chickens began to eat their way through pest infestations and political cynicism, neighboring nations took notice. At first it was curiosity, then came observation, and finally replication. In Niger, agricultural officers quietly visited 3 provinces where the Burkina Faso model had reduced crop loss. What they saw convinced them to act. Within months, Niger launched its own pilot. 200,000 chickens deployed across farming belts where armyworms and locusts had ravaged harvests. In Mali, the response was even swifter. Facing similar food insecurity, its Ministry of Agriculture signed a formal cooperation agreement with Burkina Faso, pledging joint poultry training programs and veterinary exchanges. But it wasn't just Sahelian neighbors. Kenya, battling a locust outbreak in its northeast, sent a fact-finding team. They returned with glowing reports. Tanzania's National Institute of Agricultural Research published a paper calling Burkina Faso's chicken strategy a model for eco-integrated pest management. Chad invited Burkina Faso technicians to train village councils. Even Ethiopia, long skeptical of West African policy experiments, acknowledged the cost-effectiveness of the approach. By year 2, what had started as a national gamble had grown into a regional movement, and Traoré knew exactly how to frame it. At the African Union's Agricultural Sovereignty Summit in Dakar, he stood before 54 heads of state and ministers and said, "For decades, we waited for aid that arrived too late, with conditions we could not meet. But when we released chickens, the skies cleared, the fields revived. The people believed, this is not charity, this is strategy, and strategy must come from us." The room erupted. Media outlets that had once mocked Traoré began changing their tune. The Economist, which had run the snide headline, "Burkina's Birds Poultry Populism," in year 1, published a reflective piece 2 years later. "Chickens Not Chemicals, Africa's Homegrown Food Security Movement." Le Monde Afrique ran a feature titled, "From Laughter to Leadership, How Chickens Rewrote Sahelian Politics." But perhaps the most dramatic shift came from international institutions. The World Food Program integrated Burkina's poultry data into their food resilience models. The African Development Bank earmarked $40 million to support similar chicken-based pest programs in the Sahel. Even the United Nations FAO, known for conservative approaches, published a case study citing Burkina Faso as a leading innovator in non-chemical pest response. Ironically, the very organizations that once scoffed were now building their strategies around Traoré's blueprint. But Traoré was careful not to surrender the narrative. He resisted efforts by Western NGOs to rebrand the initiative under donor-friendly names like Community Pest Engagement. In one memorable interview, when a British journalist asked if he feared the chickens becoming a global PR stunt, he smiled and replied, "Let them laugh. It's better to be laughed at and fed than admired and starving." He wore the ridicule like armor and converted it into reputation. Behind the scenes, Burkina Faso began building regional supply chains to support the growing demand for poultry-related infrastructure. Hatcheries were expanded. Feed mills powered by local grains were built in Bobo Dioulasso. Veterinary schools launched mobile units offering training across borders. Even in diplomatic circles, the chicken doctrine became a soft power tool. Traoré negotiated South-South partnerships. Chinese engineers helped build processing facilities. Brazilians offered poultry breeding expertise, and India provided vaccines. These deals had a catch. Burkina Faso retained ownership of its model. It was not selling chickens, it was exporting sovereignty. The geopolitical effect was subtle but real. In an era where African countries were often forced to choose between Western aid or Eastern influence, Traoré offered a third path: local strategy, global leverage. His model of innovation didn't demand alignment. It demanded respect. But with great visibility came new risks. Environmental critics warned of overstocking and ecological imbalance. Disease outbreaks in poultry populations, though minor, raised red flags. Western think tanks issued reports titled, "Is Burkina's chicken boom sustainable?" Some even questioned the data, suggesting rural gains were exaggerated. Yet for every critic, there were 5 success stories. And the people were watching. From Ouagadougou to Windhoek, from Lagos to Lusaka, African youth began to view the Burkina chicken not as a joke, but as a meme of resilience. Social media exploded with images, chickens in army fatigues, eggs hatching with maps of Africa, Traoré on posters next to birds labeled agents of sovereignty. The idea had gone viral, and now it was continental. But the deeper question remained. Could the movement survive beyond Traoré? Could Burkina Faso and the Sahel build a permanent shift toward ecological innovation? Or would the chickens be remembered only as a flash of genius in a moment of crisis? In the final chapter, we explore the legacy being built, how 1 million chickens laid the foundation for a generational change, not just in food, but in identity, governance, and belief. Years after 1 million chickens took flight across Burkina Faso, their legacy still echoed, not in coops or crates, but in classrooms, markets, parliaments, and hearts. By year 3, the numbers told a story of remarkable transformation. Grain losses to pests had dropped by over 50%. Egg consumption per capita doubled. Child malnutrition rates fell sharply. Rural income rose in key regions. Poultry exports opened new trade routes. And perhaps most astonishing of all, Burkina Faso had achieved food sovereignty in areas once fully dependent on international aid. But these figures were only part of the story. The real revolution was psychological. For decades, Burkina Faso had lived under the weight of external narratives. Poor, vulnerable, fragile. A country at the mercy of aid agencies, foreign experts, and distant donors. But now the people told a different story. They spoke of a nation that had fought hunger not with chemicals, but with courage. Not with charity, but with creativity. A humble chicken had become a symbol of dignity. In villages, children grew up calling them sovereignty birds. In schools, textbooks described the poultry revolution, alongside independence movements. Musicians composed songs about Traoré's gamble. Artists painted murals of flocks reclaiming the land. The chickens had entered folklore, no longer just an agricultural policy, but a cultural phenomenon. Politically, the legacy was even more enduring. By decentralizing implementation, Traoré had strengthened local governance. Councils, cooperatives, and women's groups became engines of execution. Trust in government, once eroded by neglect, began to rebuild. Civic engagement surged. For the first time in decades, many citizens believed that state power could actually work, when it listened, when it dared, and when it invested in the people's own ingenuity. Internationally, the shift was seismic. Burkina Faso, once a case study in vulnerability, became a case study in innovation. Delegations from Asia, Latin America, and other African states visited not just to see chickens, but to understand how a small nation turned ridicule into relevance. Traoré harnessed that momentum. He used the program's success to redefine foreign policy, insisting that Burkina Faso would no longer negotiate as a recipient, but as a partner. At the World Economic Forum, he famously said, "Don't send us aid, send us respect." We feed ourselves now. Trade negotiations changed tone. Loans became joint ventures. Technical exchanges replaced conditional grants. Burkina Faso began exporting not just poultry, but ideas. And this is where the brilliance of Traoré's vision revealed itself most clearly. He had never seen the chickens as just pest controllers or protein producers. He saw them as messengers, carrying a new political logic into every household. That sovereignty is not given. It is built. Built by choice. Built by courage. Built by a nation that believed it could. The model inspired a wave of ecological governance across the continent. From pest-resistant guinea fowl programs in Chad to duck patrols in rice fields of Senegal, Africa began experimenting with low-tech, high-impact solutions that placed people and nature at the center of policy. University curricula shifted. Youth boot camps for agricultural innovation sprouted. What once seemed bizarre had become the blueprint. Yet, perhaps the most powerful impact was existential. The chickens proved something fundamental, that transformation doesn't always require wealth or technology or foreign direction. Sometimes it requires audacity, a willingness to be laughed at, a refusal to wait, a readiness to act boldly with what is already in your hands. In the years that followed, even after Traoré stepped down, his chicken strategy endured. Successive governments, regardless of party, upheld the poultry program, fearing perhaps not public backlash, but public disappointment. It had become untouchable, not by decree, but by belief. And so what began as a desperate gamble grew into a generational inheritance. The chickens remained, pecking at pests, feeding children, breeding microeconomies, defending crops, holding the memory of a moment when a country chose to write its own story and never looked back. Because in the end, the gamble wasn't about chickens at all. It was about faith. Faith that even the smallest nation, mocked and underestimated, could rise. Could innovate. Could lead. If 1 million chickens could change Burkina Faso, what else could it change? That's the question now facing a continent and a world that has finally stopped laughing and started listening.